So the floor is open for discussion. We'll let others go through. Sorry.
I didn't need it.
So if the enterprise is to attack the Joycean claim that there are no moral facts because evolution evolved, that morality evolved.
Right.
It seems to me that while I find your argument quite compelling, I don't find the alternative to be any more in support of moral facts. That is, so we could say, so if I were to place my own perspective on your tripartite division, I would put myself in number 2, right? And I would say that my perspective is that there is a continuum of moral sentiments, willingness to punish, shame, and so on, that the hallmarks that you and Stitch are keying in on in the folk model. There's a continuum across norm violations. And the things that Turiel and highly educated Westerners in general want to partition off as being morality are the things that we care in this culture extremely strongly about, but that there's lots of variation of what people care strongly about. And similarly, in this culture, we have moral sentiments, albeit at a reduced level, about lots of other things, right? How you stand in an elevator and other things like this. Okay. So that means that the number 2 argument is, so what evolved was some capacity to acquire norms and to have sentiments that lead to norm compliance and norm enforcement, right? And there's going to be cultural variation as to what those sentiments are applied to, right? That doesn't lead us to the conclusion that there are moral facts in the world. That is, the alternative to debunking the Joycean view is not to arrive at the conclusion that therefore there must be moral facts. Instead, we're left with, in fact, it seems to me, the opposite perspective, which is if that version of number 2 that I just presented is correct, then there absolutely are no moral facts, because there's going to be an enormous amount of path dependence. There are multiple stable equilibria as to what constitutes a stable social arrangement such that some behaviors are highly moralized versus others.
I agree, actually. I think I agree with most of what you said. I also agree with the conclusion of Joyce's argument. So I also don't believe that there are moral facts, and I don't believe that when you speak literally, moral judgments are true. So I perfectly agree with the argument, with the conclusion of the argument, and I also would agree with what you said. I just disagree with the specific argument that's been provided. So what you seem to do is somehow to design another argument, which would be which would refer more to the diversity of what norms we are disposed to comply with. So I would entirely agree with the conclusion of Joyce's argument. I would agree also with the sketch of argument you provided. So I was more focused on the specific idea that the evolution of morality underlies the fact that there are no moral norms. And let me just have a follow-up on that. The reason why I think it's important to distinguish 2 arguments is that one could imagine a world, right, where there are moral facts, and 2 is also true, right? So basically what we have evolved is the capacity to learn and to be motivated by norms. But in that world, but not capacity to grasp a distinct kind of norm, in that world, people will have converged towards the same norms across cultures. So you will have identified what the moral facts are, either by reasoning, and so you will have some kind of cross-cultural convergence toward holding the same set of norms, right? So the claim here being that just from the fact that our capacity to grasp norms evolve, that only does not suggest that there are no moral facts. What you also need is evidence that people do not converge to the same kind of norms, that people do not seem to be discovering, either by reason or by various historical paths, the same set of norms. Right? Are you with me?
Yeah, I guess I'm a little confused about what a moral fact is, because
fair enough.
There are 2 reasons why you might have convergence in cultural knowledge around the world, and one is that it reflects something that is empirically and objectively true, independent of any culture's perspective.
That's right.
And the other is that it is a stable social arrangement, which is favored by cultural evolution because it is superior to other social arrangements. So all around the world, people may arrive at an understanding of the relationship between daylight length and temperature, or between the phases of the moon and the tides, for example. Right? They arrive at that through a process of convergent cultural evolution because it's reflecting an objectively true feature of the world. Right? But it could also be the case that all around the world, people arrive at cultures arrive at the conclusion that, for example, unprovoked battery against a member of the in-group is morally wrong, and they arrive at that conclusion because groups that had that norm did better than groups that didn't have that norm, but not because it's an objectively true feature of the world the way the relationship between the moon and the tides.
I think that's absolutely right. So the claim would have to be that if it's universal, it does not prove that people somehow discovered it by, let's say, reasoning. But that might be a necessary condition.
But
I mean,
reasoning there. So you slipped reasoning in there because I mean, cultures discover things. That's why I was careful to substitute the word culture for people. Cultures discover things that their constituent members never understand. Right? Cultures discover the importance of having rice and beans in the same diet. Cultures discover all kinds of things that none of the people who have those preferences actually understand the functionality.
Sure, and I don't think that's really an issue, right? I mean, reasoning can be just distributed, particularly. So you could have indeed people contributing to the discovery of things, but you might still think about this discovery in terms of reasoning. Maybe that has to broaden a little bit what the term reasoning really.
But I think what Dan is saying is that it isn't arrived at by reasoning.
Well, but again, I perfectly agree. I perfectly agree with that. Right? The claim was just, my claim was, from the mere fact that the capacity to grasp norms evolved, it would not follow that there are no moral facts. You need also some additional premises, such as people will converge on default norms, or when they converge with the same norms, it's not because they discover, however they discover it by reasoning or by use of the past, it's not because they discover moral facts, but because these facts have benefits such that they're going to be selected for by cultural transmission. Right? I was just trying to make the logical point that you need these additional premises to derive the conclusions that there are no moral facts from the premise that our capacity to grasp norms evolved. And again, I'm perfectly willing to grant the conclusion because I agree with the conclusion. I was just trying to see what justifies holding the conclusion. And I do believe what justifies holding the conclusion is not so much the fact that it evolved, but rather the fact that people don't seem to converge on moral truth. And when they do converge on moral truth, that seems to be for this functional, so to speak, functional reason. And I think that's really the strongest argument against moral facts, right? Yeah?
I'm a little worried about whether philosophers are making a category error here when they talk about moral facts and the truth of moral statements or facts. Whether truth and falsity or facticity is really, are those apt terms for describing moral injunctions? Or whether, well.
Yeah. Well, it's, you're right, it's also a very well-known position within philosophy that moral judgments are not truth valuable, right? That's not the kind of stuff that are true or false, but rather they might express people's emotions, or they might refer to people expressing some norms about the kind of emotions you should have. So many philosophers, in fact, would agree with you. But if you start by taking that for granted, then there's no space for debate, right? I mean, the space for debate supposes that at least it makes some kind of sense to take moral judgments as being either true or false, right? And as a matter of fact, many philosophers have held such a view. And also, most ordinary people do believe that at least many of their moral judgments are true, right? And they're just, as a matter of fact, true. Not all moral judgments, a fair number of people are relativists with it, but if you ask people, is it okay, was the genocide wrong, the genocide of the Jews during the Second World War, people are going to say, well, yes, it was wrong. Was it objectively wrong? Well, they're going to stick to their guns and say, yes, it was objectively wrong. Right? So you might say people are mistaken maybe they
No,
are.
I think they mean something different. When they
Well, that's another
when they say
implication.
that genocide was wrong, they mean something different from 2 + 2 = 4. And to treat those both as facts or having truth value, it seems to me, is to conflate 2 different things.
Well, again, it's possible that some philosophers have hold such a view, but I mean, clearly there will be no debate. It's clear you got the issue about whether the evolution of morality gives you ground for negating moral facts. You would not even have any reason to ask this question if you were just to assume as you do, right? I mean, you seem to believe it's obviously true. Well, I don't think it's obviously true that there are no moral facts, as a matter of fact. I mean, I think it's false, but I don't think it's. I think that's something that needs to be argued and not presupposed. Yeah.
So I wanted to make a little bit of maybe a pitch for like the third interpretation, but based on different grounds.
Okay.
From the ones that you presented, perhaps. I think there's 2 ways in which you might view that third interpretation. One way is that we can actually only grasp and apply and comply with certain specific norms because we have an evolved psychology which only allows us to actually grasp these norms and apply them and comply to them. So that would be sort of a, I felt that was sort of the kind of interpretation that you were, that we have a distinct moral psychology which, basically constrains quite heavily the kinds of norms that we can, actually even grasp, apply, and comply.
Mm-hmm.
That would be one interpretation. Another interpretation would be that, for example, let's say imagine a society where I can actually very well grasp and apply and comply with the norm. We can just randomly kill each other's children. I can completely understand that norm. I could apply it. I could comply to that norm. For example, if there's an even sort of more horrendous punishment if I don't actually comply with this norm of just randomly killing each other's children. But because I do have, for example, perhaps an innate desire to cherish the well-being of my children, this is not a norm which is actually going to be an attractor in some sense. So is this now, so the fact that no society converges on this norm, is this now, innately constrained or not? Well, it's not in the sense that I could have actually adhered to that norm if the trade-offs were such that, I wanted to actually endorse the norm. But, usually because our emotional systems are organized in a certain way, nobody's going to want to endorse that norm, so it's going to be a cultural attractor, so people are going to converge in different places on, basically eliminating or, not even considering that norm. So is it now innate or not? Well, it's not an argument of sort of universality. It's not really an argument of it's early developing, which I think is quite often problematic because it's really hard to quantify experience. It's just a different kind of thing where potentially we could apply it, we could comply with it, but because we have other structures inside us, we're not actually really gonna. So is that now innate or is it not? I mean, it's kind of hard to.
Yeah, I don't know. As I argue that I don't think the word innate is a very useful construct for psychologists and biologists. But let's put aside the word innate. What you described does not strike me as an instance of 3 for 2 reasons. The first one, that according to your own story, there was no real selection, right, for a capacity to apply, comply, and punish, apply and comply with these norms, right? So according to your scenario, what you seem to have is selection for capacity to apply and comply with norms. Additionally, we have evolved emotions, or maybe various evolved cognitive biases, and these together somehow constrain the nature of cultural evolution, such that some norms end up being more widespread than other norms. It's a fairly plausible scenario, but that's clearly not an instance of 3, right? There was no selection for a distinct cognitive faculty or a distinct psychological faculty specifically dedicated to these norms. What you have rather is selection for the second reading. You had an instance, what it really is an instance of the second reading. You had selection for the broader capacity to grasp norms, and that capacity in combination with various other components of our psychology, including our moral norms, explain why some norms tend to be more distributed, tend to be quite common across cultures, right?
So yeah. If I can jump in here, that speaks to the question of moral facts, because if you have the evolution of the general capacity for norm acquisition, and you have then attractors which exist for other reasons, okay, then you'll get convergent cultural evolution because of shared psychology, But it doesn't say anything about the factual nature of the beliefs that are converged upon. So by way of analogy...
Oh yeah, that I for sure agree with. Yeah.
I mean, so Joe Henrich's talk the other day, notwithstanding, I've argued that the prevalence of meat as a target for food taboos is an accident of the evolved psychology dedicated to disease avoidance that privileges meat. Right? It's an attractor. So all around the world, you have taboos like the one that Edouard referred to that target animal products. Right? But it's not because it is a fact that there is something either sacred or profane about animal protein versus other kinds of food sources in the world. Right? So it's not a moral fact.
No, I wasn't. I wasn't. I was just thinking about like what does it actually mean to say that there's sort of innate constraints on norms.
Yeah, I mean
they could be on the normative ability itself, or they could be on structures that the normative ability is connected to. There would both be innate constraints in some sense on the kinds of norms. But yeah, so I also understand your point why it's a version of 2 and not 3. So
yeah, good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was wondering if one of the things that might help clear this up, at the beginning of the talk you said that most philosophers agree on statement 1.
That's right.
But what they disagree on is whether that implies statements 4 or 5 or not.
That's right, exactly.
But then you really only described the guys who think that it does imply statement 4 or 5. So what are the philosophers who...
Oh, so it's a...
Because I'm used to dealing with those other philosophers.
So there are many kind of arguments, but one of them, which is developed by Nicola Sturgeon, is the following. It's a little bit complex. Let me try to see whether I can pull it up out of my head. So they try to ask you to imagine the following counterfactual, right? So if the world had been different in such and such respect, right, would morality have been selected for, right? And they say, so let's suppose, for example, so they take something like, it's wrong to torture puppies. Let's say, it's wrong to torture your children, right? Sorry, just in 5 seconds, I can. So they ask you to evaluate the counterfactual if. Well, I'm just, rather than saying things that are not accurate, I'd rather pass and think a little bit about it, and maybe if you stay for coffee, I might try to...
I had a second.
Okay, good. Maybe this one is going to be a softer moment.
Yeah, well, no, it's because I'm usually used to dealing with philosophers who argue that way, and I don't understand. Okay. So, it's helping me.
I mean...
we can talk later about that. I was wondering if I could push you a little bit on the research strategy that Dan was asking you about earlier. I mean, if I understood it right, you were saying we could go to different cultures and basically see if they draw the same kinds of distinctions, right? But if it's the case that really what it is just a continuum, where the ones that we label as moral are just the ones that make us upset the most, then how does that impact your research design if what you're looking for is people just drawing the distinctions?
Yeah, well, that would be bad news. I think that's. I mean, I don't know exactly. I mean, if we see what you would have is a continuous of commitment to norms as well as a continuity. Right. People will be more or less committed to norms. People will have stronger or weaker emotional reaction, maybe a better disposition to punish. So that would seem to suggest that people don't really distinguish between kinds of norms, right? Right. So if that's true, then we should not find, even in the USA, it would be very hard to identify, to put people in a position where they would draw distinctions between kinds of norms.
I mean, you could imagine people, something feels really strong to them, right?
Sure.
They feel, oh, that's terrible, and then when they're asked the question, then they essentially say there's a distinction there. No, this is different than chess, right? Absolutely. And that gets to kind of the historical thing you were talking about earlier, where it seemed like you didn't really talk much about motivation today, in terms of as being kind of something that seems like that's what's driving a lot of people's distinctions.
Yeah, I mean, I think if Dan is right, the idea that there are kinds of norms, that's something very important in cognition, I think ought to go. Right. So the only real distinction you find is norms which are more strongly held, which are more strongly held, and norms which are less strongly held. Of course, you can draw the distinction that way, right? But it's not like you have people are perfectly willing to draw different types of distinction: etiquette norms, coordination norms, moral norms, and maybe a bunch of other kinds of norms, and that they behave differently depending on what type of norms that is. So if that is right, the project of distinguishing kinds of norms within our culture and maybe across culture seems not a very plausible project. Do you agree with it?
Well, I think the problem is as much with method as anything else. So if you present people with particularly a forced choice that says, are you angry about this or you're not angry about this? Well, how angry are you about people tying their shoelaces in an idiosyncratic fashion? If presented with a choice, am I angry about this or am I not angry about this, I say I'm not angry. But if there's subtle measures that suggest that everything else being equal, if I have to choose between two individuals to interact with, I prefer the one who ties his shoes in the normative fashion, then it says I'm a little bit angry, but it never shows up in your measure.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah. That's right.
Well, it shows you have some negative emotion, doesn't show us anger.
Yeah, okay, right. Well, people can be disgusted by moral violations without being angered by them also, right? So there are a variety of different moral emotions at play.
Yeah. Right.
So, suppose we had I like to suppose, but suppose we have a naturalistic explanation of the historical processes that give rise to a set of culturally evolved norms.
Right.
Seems like a good project, but so what difference does it make if it's genetically evolved or culturally evolved? I mean, they're both just naturalistic explanations for why a particular population does what it does. So I don't see why you could run the exact same argument.
Yeah.
So non-moral distinction evolved in a particular cultural lineage. We can, I don't think we do, but we in principle could understand the processes that give rise to it. Wouldn't that then, for the same exact reason, say that there's no moral fact?
It's going to depend on the explanation. Look at fixation of scientific beliefs. Right. So clearly, when you explain why people have their own scientific beliefs, you can also give a naturalistic story. But at some time, at some place in that naturalistic explanation, you're going to refer to the world. Right. You're going to refer to properties of the world, such as evolution happened. So we have this kind of evidence available to scientists. Right. Scientists discover that evidence, so they fix their belief in such a way. So in that kind of naturalistic story, at one step, you're going to have a reference to facts about the world. In the evolutionary story, so the idea goes, you don't have that step. You can provide a perfect evolutionary story without having to mention moral facts. The idea is that maybe, if that were true, that maybe the kind of story you would have to give were a historical story or cultural story, it might be that that you would have to refer to moral facts. Exactly in the same way as for scientists you need to refer to facts about evolution to explain why people believe in evolution. Right? So there seems to be a distinction between both the naturalistic stories, right? One is evolutionary, but then the only thing that matters is its contribution to fitness, and whether or not there are moral facts is not, by hypothesis, not supposed to matter too much. You might disagree with that claim. Right? The other one is a historical story. It's also a naturalistic story, but maybe if you were to tell the story in detail, you could not tell that story without referring to moral facts. I mean, you might disagree with that claim, and I don't think, I'm not sure I agree with it, but I try to distinguish two types of story we give.
Only 1 minute, but let me ask, I'm not sure I understand your answer. So,
okay, good.
So there, the evolutionary story has to confront facts in the following sense.
Right.
We have alternative genetic variants. The genetic variants that have whatever ends up being common have to do better than the ones that don't. Now you could make a cultural evolutionary story that was similar. Dan sketched out something like that. Or you could make one where people, it had to do with people's judgments, and they judged things about the world. Now, from my point of view, I don't see why that makes a difference between a fact and a non-fact, but it seems to me that you are, in your view of the world, if I understand you right, that's the distinction, right? It's whether reasoned perception and decisions have been brought to bear on these environmental irregularities, rather than some non-reasoned selective process, either a genetic selective process or cultural process.
That's right. That's right. So, clearly, if you're a scientist, why do you have the belief you have? Well, because you made a judgment based on evidence. Where does the evidence come from? Well, it comes from the facts your beliefs are about. Right?
Yeah, most of the facts I I pulled because
Sure.
prestigious people told me they were true. I mean,
Yeah, that themselves were in connection with fact. I mean, at some point, you need some evidence. That's what makes a huge difference.
I think there's a lot of variation in that.
I want to hear.
Okay, we're all out of time. Thank you.